Alrighty, so now we're live. So here's a proposal from Steve. Do you want to walk us through it?
Sure. This is a. Sorry, I can't because I can't see the whole thing. Let me open it on my screen. This is sort of a basic proposal for some simple additions to the assembly load context to sort of make it more function complete. There was a desire to simplify usage in the creation of a plugin context to make this a concrete type instead of an abstract type. So we're proposing adding a default load implementation, which simply returns null. This is actually the implementation that's used in two of our internal assembly load contexts as well. When you return null, that method implies try to load it from the default first. And so that's sort of a logical default implementation. It says, if I'm missing a dependency, go try to load it from the default context, and then come back and call my resolving event for me to get a second chance to find the assembly. So for assembly load context usage, which would prefer late binding of assemblies as opposed to early, like it wants a second chance for assemblies that are not found in the default. This is sort of a logical default, so we've used it in a couple of our internal implementations, and it feels natural for plugins in a couple of places. The second sort of feature is adding a name, just so that the assembly load context, when you query them in a debugger or you want to print them, they have some sort of identity that's human readable. Part of that name proposal is some assembly load contexts get created automatically in the assembly load methods, load star methods. Some of those actually create assembly load context automatically. So the proposal includes that those will assign a name to the automatically created assembly load context as well. And it override the toString method for similar reasons. And then we're adding a set of an enumerable to return the context, so someone can iterate through all the existing assembly load contexts, and an assemblies property to iterate through the assemblies contained in the assembly load context. Both of those enumerable properties are snapshotted so that they represent a set of time in a specific time.
For the context property, what's the expected use case there? Is I'm iterating through it to look for a context that I want to load my assembly into?
Most of this was driven by diagnostics. As people try to understand problems with loading assemblies and they're getting loaded in the wrong context, my intent was so that you could create a graph of context in the assemblies they contain, and it would make it relatively easy to make that map.
I see. So the expected use case would basically just be a double nested loop over all the context for each assembly load context, loop over all the assemblies, and output it out in some fashion.
Right.
Yeah, I think in the discussion, other people may have thought of uses for it, but I'm not seeing it at the moment.
I mean, that's actually a really good point, because I mean, everybody who does that, like, that's probably the first thing you try to get right, is like understanding what's loaded and what's already there and where you should load your stuff into. Just doing this in the debugger and just seeing what's there is, I think, super useful. Yeah, you can see that. The one discussion that we had is like, so what ends up happening when you said they're immutable snapshots? At the time you retrieve the property, they're snapshotted?
Yeah. Well, and if you enumerated it again, it would get re-snapshotted, right? I think that's the way enumerable works, right? When you basically you start the enumeration, you iterate through it, and then you reset it. And so when you start an enumeration, it would snapshot it, and when you enumerate it again, it would re-snapshot.
So when does snapshotting happen? Like in the getter, or when you actually pull on the enumerator for the first time?
It should happen when you pull on the enumerator the first time.
Okay.
Certainly the intent is for it when you use context in a for each loop, or it would be snapshot of the instance you called it. I believe that is the way it works.
What is this baked by?
And by snapshot, you mean that if I save the enumerable and I enumerate it again later, I get the same answer?
No, it's snapshotted for the duration of the enumerable. So basically, if someone creates another context while you're enumerating, it won't give it, that new context won't appear. And it, yeah.
That makes sense. Every time you tear off an enumerator, you're getting the current snapshot.
Right.
I think that sounds reasonable to me. Like my biggest concern is that you have, threading issues where somebody, as you said earlier, you just try to create a graph, and let's say you like in the loop you're instantiating, I don't know, the XML reader which happens to go through this path and as a side effect creates another context, and suddenly your for each loop throws invalid operation exception because the collection changed where you enumerated it, right? Those are the kind of things like that. I think snapshotting seems reasonable to me because that's the best you can do. My concern with snapshotting originally was like the naive way of doing it would just say every time you query the property, you basically do a to array or something, and then the property basically accessor allocates every single time, and that would be pretty bad. In which case, you want to make it a method. If you do it basically on the first time that you call get enumerator, it's fine, I think.
And all assembly load contexts that were created get put in this list, even ones that I derive and do up myself.
Yes.
Right.
And the default one would be in the list. It would just have a name at default. Sort of logical.
What name does my assembly load context get?
So we did add a constructor to allow you to name them. If the existing code wouldn't obviously use that constructor, so right now the name would be null, but the toString would include the type name. So your my assembly load context would show up in the toString at least.
Are you unabstracting the class with this change? Or is it
Yes.
still abstract?
Yes, I'm trying to unabstract the class with this change too.
Okay.
Is there any concern, or is this like desirable that I can basically walk up now to, I can find any assembly load context in my entire process and load an assembly into it?
I mean, there's no right now. Assembly load contexts are not providing any security. So.
Yeah, I actually didn't mean from a security boundary. I meant more from an expectation. Like, if is anyone, like, if someone was creating their own assembly load context in one area of the process and someone else was doing the other, would it mess up anyone's assumptions about how their assembly load context works for arbitrary assemblies to sort of be shoved into it?
Yeah, I mean,
that would be fine.
I mean, there already exist backdoors to do this. So right now on app-domain, you can call get assemblies, and for each assembly, you can call get assembly load context to find the assembly load context. So these are sort of, to some extent, convenience APIs that we've kind of vetted for making them performant and make it easy to use in a debugger. So I don't think it's not really exposing new functionality except for the name.
And the assemblies in my assembly load context, the assemblies property gets filled up automatically as well?
Yes.
Okay. How? Sorry.
So right now it's implemented by calling app-domain get assemblies and filtering based on the ones that are in this assembly load context.
Okay.
As we iterate, and if this becomes important, there may be performance improvements that we, under the covers, the implementation of the internal assembly load context may carry that list itself.
What are the open issues?
There was a suggestion that context should be called all context because some people felt like felt like a better semantics in a for each kind of reading.
Yeah,
For
because you
each,
say right now AssemblyLoadContext, which is kind of weird. Yeah, you could just call it all. Might make the for each loop a little bit easier to read.
Can you scroll down, Emo,
I can.
so we can see the open issues? Oh, okay, that was it.
sorry.
We were missing that list. Sorry, there was one thing in the list.
Yeah. So the thing I asked this question on the thing and I don't recall the answer entirely. So the idea is that if you can new up an assembly load context now, right? And then I can say load with an assembly name or with a path, right? Like the path one completely makes sense to me because you clearly detect, you just point to an assembly. But then as this assembly is basically being used, other loads are being triggered by a name, right? And then this guy would just return null. And I think you said that basically if you return null from this method, it just means that some default policy is being applied. Is that correct?
Right. So currently, null, when that method returns null, the search continues in the default assembly load context to look through the trusted platform assemblies. And if that fails, then this assembly load context resolve. I get the names mixed up, but effectively the resolving event will get fired, giving this assembly load context a chance to load that. So one of the other API extensions we did for 3.0 was the assembly dependency resolver.
Right.
And in the sample code, one of the primary ways that's used is to attach that assembly dependency resolver to the assembly load context resolving event.
Gotcha. So the primary way to customize then effectively moving forward is not to override the method, but just instantiate it in context and subscribing to the event, which basically makes it open-ended.
Yeah, I mean, there's still sometimes a motivation if you want an assembly to be able to be loaded both in a custom assembly load context and the default, and you want to make sure it's loaded in your assembly load context before the default.
Right.
Then you'd have to override this method, but that's a fairly advanced use case.
Is there any way for me to run the default policy to resolve it to an assembly? Or is the way you go to assemblyLoadContext.default.load by name?
Right now, the normal way is return null. I think you can also say AssemblyLoadContext.default load with. I don't know the exact same, but there is a method on the assembly load context to do that.
Right.
So maybe you can certainly say load from path. I think there's a load by assembly name too, which effectively triggers this scenario. But then also second app domain event.
But the side effect of those APIs is that they also load the assembly, right? If I just want to say, can you resolve this guy? I have no way of doing that, correct?
Right. And it is certainly a desire. The problem is with our current design with the callbacks, we can't predict what the callbacks will do because the callbacks all actually do the load.
Yeah, they all return assembly, I see. Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
And so we'd really like this more to be a data structure kind of thing. Like, here's the list of assemblies I know about and will load. With the existing design, that's not feasible.
Makes sense.
Hey, Steve, how does this relate to the collectible assembly stuff? So I see the is collectible equals false at the top. If I'm holding on to an assembly load context, like the reference to this instance, does that keep alive everything inside it?
I believe it should, yes.
Okay. Okay. So with the all context thing, if I were holding on to that enumerator, I would basically be preventing anything from being collected, right?
I think that enumerator, the way it's implemented right now, I snapshot the weak references. So those
Okay.
weak references are not holding it open, and as you iterate through it, I check to see if the weak reference is valid before returning it.
Oh, so it's not actually a snapshot in that I could start enumerating, the ALC could be collected, and then it could show up as a null weak reference and go in as I'm enumerating, it won't be there anymore.
Yep.
Right. So that seemed the best solution for me. That's what I chose to do. We could, yeah. I mean, I could hold. Yeah, I think that's the best.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable, right? Because basically you don't expose the race conditions to the customers, right? I mean, the race condition, there's a race condition, but you don't quite know when it happens, but it's also not relevant, right? Basically, I think the API shape is nice because it doesn't expose the big reference concept, right? It just means that whenever you pull in the assemblies, we give you what's still alive, and that might be less. That seems reasonable.
It does mean that someone who's enumerating the ALCs, if they were to then hold on to the ALC, they're then preventing it from being collected, but that's on them.
Well, my understanding is that they don't, right? Because what Stephen just said is that they hold on to the weak reference in the enumerator.
Right, but they could go put it in a container.
Right. No, I think under the covers, there's a weak reference around the assembly load context. This is unwrapping that weak reference and handing back the ALC. As long as they hang on to that ALC, it won't be collected, is my understanding.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, yes.
If they call two lists, it'll keep it in the list as long as that stays rooted. If they call get enumerator manually and advance it once, as long as that enumerator stays alive, it still has a strong reference to the current property. There are ways that you could accidentally.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I want to make sure I understood how this works.
It's true that anything holds it alive, right? If I just hold on to the assembly, I would hold up the context as well, right?
Right.
So yeah. I mean, that's the thing with collectible stuff, right? You don't hold on to it. All right, I think that's pretty much all the questions that I had. I think there were a few that I asked and I got answers for already. And
there was a more controversial change that we forked off into a separate review, and I at least would like to look at that.
Which one was that?
It's if you look at the bottom, it's 36236.
Sorry, at the bottom, where?
One of the last late comments near the bottom of the thread.
Oh, this one here?
Yeah, this 36236. Yep, that one.
Okay.
This is really a long write-up, so.
So what's the actual API?
The API is near the bottom. That's part of it. It's repeated. Each fragment's repeated as I go through the document.
Interesting. So can you give us?
So basically, as we've tried to implement plugins, XUnit, and WPF, we've seen problems with the set of the current APIs were originally designed to take advantage of the ambient app domain current domain. And as we've moved from app domains into assembly load contexts, we don't have that ambient property anymore. And so code that was intended to run within an app domain suddenly becomes ambiguous. And so we're trying to infer the assembly load context from an assembly, and it's not a one-to-one mapping. It's a one-to-many mapping. So in the right up here, that plugin dependency can be used in one assembly load context, but loaded in another. And so what we're trying to infer where it's being used from in a place where we can infer it. And so this is proposing adding an ambient property for this reflection case to sort of correspond to the current app domain property that we lost. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to understand, so the write-up is long, hopefully readable. So I'm proposing adding a read-only property, which is active for context-sensitive reflection, and I'm proposing 2 methods that return iDisposable, activate for context-sensitive reflection, to basically set this property in a using block and to clear it when you leave the using block.
So basically, I'm still a bit lost. Like, how am I, like, who is setting it and who is using it?
As I was designing it, the idea that I had was that the person that was loading the plugin loader would set the property as it entered the plugin. Basically saying, I'm turning over this thread of execution to this plugin. I expect the APIs to behave as the plugin's the current active context. And so as the plugin loads that plugin, it would call a using block before it entered the code in the plugin. And so, and right now the proposal is this to be an async local property, so that it follows the asynchronous thread of control.
So what does it now mean that everything that is basically requesting AssemblyLoadContext.default is actually returning the other one? Or does it just mean that every time you now trigger a load, by default it goes into that guy?
You can, if you scroll down, there's a set of affected APIs. Right now the set's fairly limited. So it is assembly load. It says activate or create instance cases where there's an assembly name which effectively triggers a load. There's these assembly load cases which are triggering loads. And then there's a few more in like type get type, which are triggering loads when the type name is fully assembly qualified, not necessarily fully qualified.
I see. So when I call any of these APIs, they would basically ask for the active for context-sensitive reflection context and would put stuff into that.
Right. Using the fallback methodology that AssemblyLoadContext has determined effectively. So those AssemblyLoadContexts sometimes resolve assemblies in other AssemblyLoadContexts, but it would follow that AssemblyLoadContext fallback algorithm.
And by default, this one is null until it's set, right? Is that fair?
Right.
And then when it's null, you just load it into default, I suppose?
Right now, the current behavior of these APIs is they look at their caller's assembly and figure out what AssemblyLoadContext it's loaded into. And so that's the AssemblyLoadContext that's being used right now. And the problem is only when you have a stack of assemblies and one of them is in like a framework that's sort of required to be loaded in default, but really wants to be loaded in the plugin's context.
So is the active one a stack?
It is a using stack.
Okay.
So when you call using, it's creating an object that preserves the previous one, and when you leave the using block, it restores the previous.
And what happens if somebody doesn't dispose the disposable?
It gets set till it's disposed. I mean, when the object is collected, it'll clear it.
Okay. I mean, will it clear it, or will we, teach them to fix their code by just fail fasting the process?
Right now, it's clearing it. I mean, I suppose, I don't know. Right now, it's clearing. So the destructor right now is calling the dispose. It's possible we could throw an exception, or maybe in debug code it could throw an exception.
I'm just, curious because it seems like letting one of these dangle would be very weird.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
we
there's-
would expect everyone to put it in the using, but if they want to do something weird, I feel that they should understand what happened, but maybe it's not important. I'm just asking the question.
Yeah. It would seem a little weird for someone to say iDisposable equals ALC activate context sensitive for reflection, but I suppose it could easily do it. It would be problematic.
And is this something that we expect people? This should be fairly rare, right?
Yeah, I expect plugin framework developers would implement this and use this. We probably use it in our test cases. So XUnit has hit this issue. Our test cases for WPF have hit this issue.
But it's not going to
So
be.
it's a fairly advanced scenario. Should be fairly rare.
Right. So like the question I was building up to is, should, instead of being opaque iDisposable, should it be a struct disposable so it can stack alloc and not GC? But if it's rare,
What is this?
Yeah.
I didn't understand the context of that. So there was a note in the review of this that the iDisposable would heap allocate, and one of the recommendations was to put it on a struct to minimize that.
right. So
But then I was thinking boxing would still have to come into play.
So the way that the using statement works, if it's provably a value type, it direct dispatches the call to dispose and it never boxes it.
Oh, so yeah, I'll definitely make it a struct. And
Yeah, there's also another option to basically not create the helper for disposing at all and make it just a property that you just set and clear, and you kind of are in control. What you want to do with it, right?
Meaning you let the caller use the try finally block on their own.
Yeah, for example, right? Because even today, right, there are a number of kind of gotchas with this that you can kind of not build the stack properly and forget to dispose it, or so.
I mean, it's certainly easier in the sense it's only one API instead of two.
Right, but I mean, if we expect that the average process never does this and the average plugin hosting process does this once, then I don't know that the box is that.
The plugin process, depending on the kind of the plugin architecture, right? You can imagine some plugins might want to kind of generate, or some plugin kind of infrastructures might want to generate a proxies between all plugins, and then they would set and clear this property each way through this proxy, right?
So when are they setting that then? Every single time they go across the proxy?
Yeah, you can imagine if somebody really wanted to mimic what happens with subdomains, right? On subdomains, when basically you go from one subdomain to other subdomain, you always go through a proxy that basically switches the current subdomain and, like marshals the argument and whatnot, right? So if somebody wanted to mimic this kind of behavior, they would basically want to auto-generate the proxies for all the communication, and they would always want it to set and clear this property
I see.
in that proxy.
But then at that point, don't, like, if you set the property, you have to remember the old value, right? Otherwise, bad things will happen.
Sure, yeah. It's like no different from the subdomain transitions, right? The subdomain transitions always also remember the old value. So when you go back, you kind of.
I mean, making a struct that is disposable, that handles the remember the previous value and to put it back.
Yeah, I mean.
So there's another part of this proposal that, the proposal is to flow it with async.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of makes it kind of more interesting.
That means it would box anyway?
That means that it would kind of participate in the, the async local thing.
Yeah, I mean, this would be orthogonal, right? It's just the property itself is stored in an async local, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that the caller of the using is in an async context.
Well, but if
Right.
if
The async threads would if the async thread escaped the using block, that it would remain set on that async thread, which is, I think, the correct behavior.
Right. Well, let me put it differently. Like, depending on, like, if you want to evolve the behavior here, like today you say, oh, we don't do an async local, tomorrow you do it in an async local. I don't know, like you remember the value, you some other policy that you want to apply. If you make it a method that returns an basically an idisposable and you expose property only via read only, you get to you basically encapsulate that policy, right? As soon as you say it's a property that has a getter and a setter, and everybody has to follow the ceremony correctly, then well, you better never change that ceremony.
Yeah, and you have to sort of, you can't mandate it, right?
The property, like, I don't think the structs give you any extra kind of safety. Like like in particular for the async case, I don't think the property versus struct makes any difference.
well,
We have, for example, today we have culture info.current culture that also flows with async, and people just set and create it, or do whatever they want with it.
I think Emo's comment is if right now it's one property that you set and then you set back in a finally, but then next release it becomes 2 or 3. That if it's encapsulated in the push the state, pop the state with a disposable, then the API does its own housekeeping. Instead of making everybody go find all the places they did this and update all of them, and then make sure they didn't update all of the pushes and then forget to update all of the pops. So
yeah, like to me, it's not about safety. It's more about if you ever want to change the ceremony of going from one context to the other. Like if you're sure it's only going to be a single property and you just restore the old value, I think it's pretty much the same about model of lines of code everybody has to write. It just means you better never change that.
but if all that's flowing with the async context is the one assembly load context, then the struct disposable, when you push in, it assigns it. When you pop out, the async state snapped it, so you don't care. But then the synchronous flow now has the restored correct value. So it seems to still match with the disposable pattern.
Yeah, I'm fine either way, honestly. Like it's more of a function of, it's a very advanced API. I'm not sure the name makes sense to most people. To me, it's not clear what it means. I would have to read the entire write-up in order to make sense of that. But maybe that's kind of what you want to convey.
It started out to be current.
You had some object that you stored, and then you cleared it out by clearing that object that was the wrapper for it.
But when the async thread finishes, it doesn't need to be restored because its thread's basically gone.
No, that thread gets reused for a next work item.
Right, well, the async would flow into it.
So for that, in general, unless you're doing something complicated, by default, like if you did task.run or you did thread pool queues or work item or something, and the async local is only going to exist for that scoped delegate or whatever that you passed, and then the underlying infrastructure is going to clear it out. But if you did execution context.capture, you're basically holding on to that indefinitely until you drop that context.
Okay.
But if we cared about that, and if we wanted to force it to be cleared effectively from everywhere when you did dispose, then the thing that you stored in the async local, you'd want it to be like a strong box of T rather than a T. And then on dispose, we would null out the strong box dot value. I don't know if that's what we want, but that's how you probably do it.
Okay.
Right. Now, I had thinking that the pattern would not want that.
Okay.
Should the current value be exposed as a static property anywhere, or is that not useful?
It is. The proposal includes that above.
Yeah,
so this is these are partial fragments. The summary proposal is at the bottom, but as I walk through each of the APIs. So there is a property that's active just above this.
Yeah, so the totality is this one here.
Yeah, I wonder
So
if
that
it should
last-
just be like current context sensitive context, and then instead of activate, just call make context sensitive or something. I don't know. These are off in the weeds, so it doesn't matter so much. But I feel that most of the places that we have the static things like this, the static is called current.
Okay.
I don't.
You could just call it current context sensitive reflection context, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like a name that you can actually say without laughing out loud.
Right. And then figure out
I
what
can laugh out loud.
the verb for the methods is, whether it's activate or set or.
You could even just use.
I feel like use needs
Although
an
using-
argument.
Well, you could say start context sensitive reflection, right?
Yeah.
Or begin, I guess. Begin, start.
Begin implies that you're the oldest of the async type.
Fair enough.
Enter.
Enter works,
Yeah,
actually.
enter context sensitive reflection.
Actually, enter kind of implies that there's no corresponding end method, which is nice. So let me just write this up. So what did we say? Current sensitive reflection context. And then we said context sensitive reflection.
Did you want the context on that one too, or no? Maybe not.
Well, I mean, I would not put a context in there because I mean, for example, you call it on a static, so there's already a context in there somewhere.
Okay.
Yeah, you call it context sensitive reflection, right? Which is not helping because you have the context twice.
Region sensitive.
I think that's the best.
You said current sensitive reflection context, which seems reasonable.
Yeah, like that works for the buff one. The bottom one is like enter sensitive reflection seems a bit weird.
I mean, the trouble is when I saw it, I was like sensitive, like this is a security boundary, but it's just context sensitive. But context doesn't mean context in this.
Well,
case.
you could get rid of the word sensitive. I don't know. Current
Contextual.
reflection context. Yeah, contextual maybe.
Yeah.
Contextual, I think, is a great word. Actually.
Intercontextual reflection context. Correct contextual reflection context.
Yeah, I think that's readable. I mean, it's still not.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't
like
need to be.
it's not never going to be pretty.
It doesn't need to be perfect.
That's going to be good.
Yeah.
So here's
You
what
got
I
a
have.
choice of ugly or ambiguous.
Like that.
Yeah, that's fine. Makes sense to me.
Yeah, except we were going to make the replace side disposable with some sort of opaque struct.
What's this?
Making
an opaque.
Yeah, making a public struct that doesn't necessarily expose any of the fields. Just says I'm a struct and I'm disposable.
Okay. Yeah, the struct name could just be something like the same as the property name almost. Does it, being an opaque struct, could obfuscate the docs? I guess in the docs you just have to say that it is a struct, or do you specify the inheritance of the opaque struct so that it includes iDisposable?
I mean, it would say that it's iDisposable.
Okay.
But if it's
How about this?
no, because if the return type is the
Sorry.
return type has to return.
I forgot to update the return type.
Yeah.
Of course I did.
Just
But-
contextual reflection reads funny.
Yeah, it's not that the other proposals didn't have that problem.
Right.
Yeah, I mean the name of the struct feels weird, but
Yeah, I think it should be
How would you name it?
disposable contextual reflection context.
Well, but it's not the context itself, right?
but it's a different kind of context. It's the context that when it goes away, the context changes.
Maybe it should be scope instead of
Scope.
context.
That works. Contextual reflection scope, then?
Yep.
That works for me. I mean, I'm fine with either way. So do we like the nested struct? I think it makes sense because nobody will care for this thing.
Yep. Nobody should be saving it.
Yeah, you just need to fix the return type again.
Fuck my life. Editor browser will never be okay with that too.
Sure. I mean, again, nobody when they're looking at assembly load context and they hit dot, they want to see the useful statics that the other proposal's adding, not this one.
Yeah, that seems reasonable, right? All right, then let's do this. Then let me approve this one.
Yep. Ship it.
Ship it while
Did
it's
we
hot.
approve the previous one?
So this one, and
Look, we
then
actually got through things. Today.
and then the other one here as well. Like I just need copy and paste some notes in here. And then we have the same thing here, API, and then we're done. All right, that was easy
Easier than some things we've reviewed.
for sure. All right, sorry Stephen for all the delay, but like Steve, sorry, it took us a while to get to the backlog.
Yeah, I'm sure. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. See you later. All right, now I have to clear various things. Bye guys online.